Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to our next session here at the Startup Festival. So leading on from a fantastic panel earlier on pre-seed funding, we are now going to be looking a bit further along and looking at actually investors and what investors are looking for in you guys as startup founders. And to chair this session, we're very lucky to have Mark Andrews, who's MD at Pharma Ventures, who's going to lead the discussion. And then fantastic also to have three great friends at the BIA, Paul from J&J Innovation, Oliver Sexton and Liz Klein. So I'm going to hand over now to Mark, who can introduce the session and the speakers.
Yes, thanks a lot for that, Jane. I will start off with the introductions. So my name is Mark Andrews, and they've asked me kindly to chair this session, so they probably don't know what they've let themselves in for. So as was already mentioned, I'm a managing director at Pharma Ventures. Pharma Ventures are a corporate advisory group that we work purely in the area of life sciences. And basically, if there's a message you want to understand about Pharma Ventures is that we help people do deals in the life science space, and that's across a wide range of different areas, which I won't bore you all with now. Just a little bit to my background. Originally a scientist, I spent 15 years actually as a VC investor myself, before then moving into the consultancy space. So that might be one of the reasons why they've decided to reach out to me to chair this session. So the session is going to be about what VCs wish that the founders knew before they come and talk to them. So hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion. But before we get into that, I'm going to ask my fellow panelists here to introduce themselves, and I'm going to go purely on what order the computer has decided to display them in front of me. So I'm not showing any favoritism when I hand over first to Oliver and ask him to introduce himself.
Thanks, Mark. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Oliver Sexton. I'm an investment director from a fund called UKI2S, the UK Innovation Science Seed Fund. Used to be known as Rainbow. It's about a £30 million VC fund, and the job of the fund is to get companies off the ground from foundation through seed to Series A. We're an evergreen fund, so we invest for as long as it takes. And we've got an interest in really big, risky ideas. I know a lot of VCs say that, but we mean it. So we like backing kind of micro moonshots. We're kind of relatively relaxed if technology fails. It's a bit disappointing if a company fails because it's not got a big enough idea. We've been investing in life sciences now for about 15 years. I've been at the fund for about 6 years. And since we set the fund up, we've had a couple of exits, and we are investing continuously as an evergreen fund. There's no particular time to approach us. Just do have a look at our scope criteria, and it'd be lovely to talk.
Thanks for that, Oliver. And then the next one in the order would be Liz.
Hi, my name's Liz Klein. I have had quite a varied career, including on what's called the sell side, which is looking at listed businesses. So from the very large, Smith & Nephew type size, down to the very small. Over the last 5-6 years, I have done a variety of things, including spending 4 years working with Bioscience Managers, which is an Australian-based venture capital fund that invests across a whole range of companies, medtech and biotech. And they have been doing some work here in the UK alongside Downing on some of their investments. I also, the other part of my job is that I work with some select companies and help them position themselves for fundraising. And I'm currently working with a variety of businesses along those lines.
So thanks a lot for that, Liz. And then last but by no means least, as the saying goes, Paul.
Hello, everyone. Paul Ashley. I work for Johnson & Johnson Innovation. I'm based in the London Innovation Centre. And my particular remit there is leading on data science opportunities. But Johnson & Johnson, as you probably know, is a large organisation, has a number of areas of interest. broadly separated into three: medical devices, consumer health, and pharmaceuticals. I'm interested in the pharmaceutical side. And although we're not an investor per se, we invest in the innovation ecosystem in a number of ways. We do make strategic investments for equity through JJDC, our investment arm, but we also have incubation facilities and partnerships through our JLab scheme. And then we also interact in a more traditional way via licensing collaborations with research institutions, small companies, etc. So a number of ways of interacting with J&J. I'm relatively new to the organization, joined in November. Prior to my role here, I was leading the life science group at Oxford University Innovation, which is the technology transfer arm at Oxford, helping to create a large number of companies over a 9-10 year period. Anything from chicken welfare apps to gene therapies. So really great experience. Prior to that, I was at AstraZeneca in a business development role. And prior to that, I'd created a spin-out company myself from some of the research I was doing in my PhD, which was quite a long time ago.
Okay, thanks a lot for that, Paul. So I believe the first step that we're going to go through is to have a questionnaire. So a quick questionnaire for the audience. So I believe that's going to be run by Georgina. So Georgina, over to you. Okay, so Georgina's not talking. So hopefully everybody in the audience can see.
Yeah, so you've got a poll there. Where are you currently with regards to fundraising? So if you just like to, if the audience could select just to give us an idea of where you currently are. I've got not yet planning fundraising, planning to raise, had the first meeting, several meetings, and just completed, just to give us an idea of where everybody is. So we'll just take a few more seconds for that, and then Georgina or Sam can let us know, turn it around and show us the results. Okay, so I don't know if you can see that, Mark, but we've got 15% on not yet planning, 27% on planning to raise but haven't contacted investors, 23% had the first meeting, 27% several meetings, and 8% just completed fundraising. So a real spread.
Thanks for that, Jane. Yeah, so we have the majority are probably somewhere within a process. Let's put it that way, or at least about to go out to have a process. So good. That gives us an overview of where we are now. So hopefully, I mean, you've heard the backgrounds of the people here. So hopefully, we're going to have a good discussion. There's lots of different touch points that the panel have had. About how VCs think, and what would be good to know before you go in and meet with one of these people. So hopefully we'll have a good discussion. So to start off, maybe what I'll do initially is to ask each panelist in turn what would be the leading thing that they wish people came to them and knew before they went in to their first meetings. And once we get through that, then maybe I'll throw a few hand grenades into the meeting and see if I can provoke a little bit more of a discussion. So I started with Oliver last time, so this time I'll move one along the list, and this will make Liz's life a little bit easier because she gets the open field. So Liz, if there was one thing that you would like, people to know before they either came in front of you with a plan, or what you would, tell them that they should have in mind to make sure that they knew about before they went into a meeting, that first meeting with a VC?
Well, my main tip is do your homework. So work out, number one, do you fit the fund? Is the fund investing in your size business, in your area, geographically, in your area of technology? Secondly, if you know who you're meeting at the fund, do your homework on them. Look on LinkedIn, look on their bios on their website. Make sure that you know what it is you're presenting. If the person that you're meeting is particularly interested in shrimp manufacture growing, and you're coming in with something that's going to completely destroy that market, make sure you have a reason why that works. So do your homework. That's my biggest tip, because there's nothing more annoying than hearing somebody come in and having obviously not even worked out what you're investing in and what your criteria are, and completely getting the wrong thing right off bat.
Yeah, good. So that's quite a catch-all area, actually, doing your homework. So I mean, it's a good place to start. Actually, maybe what I should have said at the beginning to the audience out there, which we seem to be going up and down at the moment. If there are any questions that people want to see whether the panel have a view on, please feel free to put them in the chat. I've got the window open here next to me, so that's why I'm not necessarily looking at the camera directly straight on sometimes, because I'm having a look to see if anything's coming in, and then we can see if we can pick up those questions as well. But then Paul, just under that same umbrella, I mean, Liz has already kind of touched on this do your homework on who you're talking with. Are there any, is there something that you'd like to add to that, that rather larger umbrella space, that what other areas of homework do you think are useful for the audience to know?
But I suppose related to that, I would say never overestimate how much someone knows about a subject. So, I would say majority of investors are generalists, not so specialists. And in my former role, I was working with some really bright Oxford academics, so I was pretty confident I wasn't the smartest person in the room. And it would always be really helpful when someone didn't underestimate, my understanding of a general area, but really importantly didn't overestimate, so breaks me in quite gently. And if you're getting a lot of pitches from companies, there's only so much you can go into the detail, and it's really helpful when you're being presented to that somebody eases you into the scientific area. Doesn't labor it, doesn't spend too long, but spends the appropriate amount of time in giving you the context. And that's another area that I always, giving it some thought ahead of today, always jars a little, and this is just a personal thing, is when people focus on the market that they are accessing, saying, if we create this, shrimp farming improvement, we can access a market of billions of pounds. It never really resonates with me, and the devil is in the detail of how much of any market you can access because of the nature of your innovation. And there's never the time in the pitch to really go into that. So when someone starts to talk to me about market access, I just have questions. Whereas if someone explains to me the problem that they're solving, and I can understand that that is a problem in the world, and they convince me that their innovation does solve that problem, that starts to get me intrigued. So it's just a different kind of visceral response to it. That's just a personal thing. I don't know whether the others feel the same.
Well, before I hand over to Oliver or ask Liz if she has a point on that, I mean, I would, from my experience as well, I would agree with you, Paul. At some level, at some point in the future discussions, you are going to get into discussions around what exactly the market is that or the market size that you both sides think that you're going to be able to capture with the technology or product or your fancy new shrimp farm. That you're going to bring to the market, but it's probably not the right place for the first meeting when you're really trying to, like you say, talk about is there an unmet need out there, and having a convincing story why you're going to be able to capture that. So Oliver, sorry, you're
yeah, no, don't worry. I think they're both good points. I think what I really like to see on the premise that somebody is do their homework, so they know that they've been in scope for us, and we would like to help them, vice versa, because it's always a two-way conversation. Quite often, and maybe because we invest really young, I meet lots of people that are obsessed with technology, and it's interesting, and we want to understand it in great detail eventually. But what I really want to know first was, why are you doing this? What problem are you going to solve? And then the other part of that same question is take a step back and think, is it big enough to worth spending 5, 10 years of your life doing? And I mean that, bluntly. The VC world is high risk. So the company's got to get a big return, be VC friendly, and you've got to be really focused on it as a founder. And I meet lots of companies where they've got a tiny little idea and it's a little bit boring and it doesn't raise VC funds. So I would say my 2 tips merge together: focus on the why you're doing something, to be clear with the investor what difference you're going to make to the world, and then also think, is it big enough idea to get excited about? So noise sensitive microphone, for example, it turns on.
It is. It's just told me that I'd forgotten to unmute myself. So I'm probably well, no, I am definitely sure it won't be the last time I do it. Over the last 14 months of these kind of meetings, I've done it at least once in every one, I think. Anyway, so sorry. No, I'd agree with you. I mean, to some level, the idea that people are investing has to be big enough, or has the potential to be big enough for it to be worthwhile, the investment that's going to be put into it. So I'm going to throw a question out now to the 3 of you. You've mentioned risk a couple of times, Oliver, you yourself directly. And of course, we all know that venture capital itself is a risk-taking area. Now, I can remember back in my time that sometimes investors would look at an idea and they would turn it down politely, of course, hopefully, and then you kind of get into a discussion about why you've done that. And of course, most VCs tend to try and find a way that a reason why they've turned it down that doesn't lead into this discussion, because at the end of the day, you're not going to be convinced, or very little chance of being convinced once you've got that reply back. But you've mentioned risk. Do you see venture capital? Does the panel see venture capitals as basically risk takers or risk managers? Sorry, and so I started with. Sorry.
I was going to say, well, they should be risk takers, because venture capital should be taking risk and trying new ideas. It should be the opportunity to back the next, Moderna, the next big idea. In fact, I find a lot of venture capital try to corral risk and reduce risk, not through necessarily adding value themselves, but by focusing on following other people that they feel have a better understanding, and not trying to be an outlier.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember myself when I first started in this career of VC. It's many years ago now, but the one memory that stuck in my mind was a little cartoon that I saw, where you could see somebody in a suit sat behind a table. You couldn't actually see him; you could just see his arms on the telephone, and he's being contacted by a potential company that he could invest in. And instead of starting asking questions about the technology or the market, his first question is, well, who else is interested? So that definitely rings a bell with me, that this people are tending to be a little bit, shall we say, following like a shoal of fish, all gathering together to make sure they're not going to be the ones that get picked off. So Oliver, let's go around the other way this time. So you're not at the end of the line. How would you see that question?
I'm going to disagree with you, Mark and Liz. So I'd point out, so we as a fund, we lead nearly all our deals, and so there's nobody to follow when we first get interested. So I think risk, we need to break it down to what risk we're talking about. So broadly speaking, there's risk that the founders can't deliver what they're going to do, and you can manage that by helping build a board, by putting teams around the founders, and helping the founder understand what they're good at and what they maybe need some support with. There's technical risk. We're happy with that as a fund. Other funds invest later. I think that is part and parcel of the VC world. So Liz is right. It's managing risk in terms of picking the bits of the company that you're happy to take a gamble on. And then there's the kind of commercial risk. And there's 2 bits there. The funding risk is real. So for young companies and later companies, it's all very well having a fund interested, but unless that fund's going to do the whole round on their own, then there is a risk that you can't raise. That needs to be managed. And that's where the VC syndicating is helpful. So in an ideal world, everybody does some diligence and invests in a company at the same time as you've got enough cash. But it is worth thinking about that. And then the last one, which I think is interesting, we think a lot about is where is this money going to get you to? So if we get to a point with a company founder, they can deliver what they're going to say they're going to do. It's a big enough idea to put the money in, so it's worth the technical risk. Can you raise enough money, or are you raising enough money to get to a good proof point that you're going to get somebody else to invest in you later? And that's a key risk for us. I spend quite a lot of time thinking about that, especially because we do healthcare, but we do other areas. And outside of healthcare, it's a bit less clear sometimes. What is that proof point to get an investor engaged? So I would say we think risk is great. It's part and parcel of the job, but you can take sensible decisions to mitigate it.
I mean, good, and it's actually good that you have a different opinion, Oliver. So that's exactly why we've got different people on here. So and to be honest with you, my background from where I worked, we definitely took an approach similar to you. I mean, we quite often went on our own on investments where we had a true belief. But it did mean that wherever we identified risk within an investment, we would try and mitigate it, as you mentioned, but definitely not necessarily following people. So Paul, do you have any comments that you want to add to this element of the discussion?
Yeah, sure. I suppose if we're trying to sort of provide comments that are helpful to folks, I think it's important to remember that. This is a human interaction, and therefore, I suppose you will have different levels of risk acceptance with different individuals within the same venture funds in the same round as the syndication. And I suppose this links to the homework point as well. Is different investors will have different views on risk at different points in their funding cycle, and so getting a relationship with your investor early is the thing to do, and understand what their appetite to risk is. Now, it's only human that people would on the basis of an investment want to protect their potential returns and their potential downsides, and I mean, maybe it's an open question as to whether US investors view that differently to UK investors, but that's probably oversimplifying things. And there's plenty of commentary that there's loads of money available in the US, and the UK aren't great at doing big early stage risky investments, but that probably doesn't do credit for all the layers of complication that I've just mentioned. So the takeaway message, I think, is that it's a human experience, and you've got to build a relationship with an investor that works for you and understands the journey that you're going on.
Sorry, I did it again. I told you I would. So that brings me on to a slightly, or a very connected point there. You've already brought up the fact that things are a personal interaction. And that can be, I suppose, one of the things that you also have to be well aware of before you go into a meeting with a VC. There are, different approaches, or at least I have heard of funds or people that tend to have kind of different approaches to the question of technology versus people, or product versus people, whatever you want to talk about there. So, I mean, obviously, I've got my opinion on that, but I'm not currently in the investment world. So it would be good to hear from the panel where they stand on that kind of picture. I mean, so unfortunately, you were the last one to talk, Paul, but I'm going to go straight back to you just so that we keep mixing it up a bit. But then at least your part in this will be over. So where do you stand? Either you personally or in J&J on how much weight you put on the technology and the product and the team of people that are presenting it to you?
Yeah, sure. So it's a composite of all these things, particularly in J&J, and my role is to try and match up innovation that's going on outside J&J with the needs inside. So I've got a relatively specific brief around the problems that I'm looking to solve, and some scope to sort of draw attention to novel stuff that maybe we're not aware of, and it's an area that we can move into. But the technical ask is quite specific within my role. having said that, there are, you will find a lot of quotes that say that, that indicate that people would rather invest in mediocre technology and a fantastic team rather than the other way around. So, I have to say I'm left really enthusiastic about some teams wishing that they had a better technology when I speak to them. So again, yeah, as you say, it's a human interaction, and for some reason you can, on a 10-minute pitch, get really excited about a group of people. I think don't underestimate the value of making a human interaction really motivating and exciting for an investor. But at the end of the day, the technical problem has to be solved, and the innovation has to be worth investing in.
Thanks for that, Paul. So I won't add anything now, and I'll let the other two speak first. So if we go to Liz next, just to keep it mixed up.
Yes. Yeah. So I think it's a very interesting point. And, I sort of come back to my business school VHS versus Betamax argument, which is Betamax had the better technology, but they didn't commercialize it, as well as VHS when we're talking about videotapes many, many years ago, because VHS thought commercially about the end user market. But saying that, however good the team is, if they don't have a really nice piece of technology that you want to back, it's irrelevant. And I agree with Paul. I've met plenty of teams you think, God, they're great, but the technology is just rubbish. And I just can't get excited about this because, as everybody has said, it's a human interaction. We've got to be as excited as you because we're coming on this journey with you for the next 2, 5, 10 years, and we want to see that product come out. But then again, I've also seen a number of technologies that I have been excited about, but the team is unbackable, and not because they don't present well, but it's because they haven't thought about where they position the product, how commercial it is, who the competitors are, and how to get this product to market, because it isn't just us being excited by your intellectual idea. It's about that intellectual idea ending up on the shelf and being bought by somebody.
Okay, good. That's interesting. Oliver, anything to add?
Yeah, well, just one thing. So teams evolve. And I think that's a conversation that's worth having with people. And depending on their audience's interaction with VCs, you probably had that already. So, we've got companies where the CEO is great at the job, and then we've got companies where the CEO is terrible at the job. And I'm sure they feel the same about us as investors. But the challenge is that you need to pick the team that suits the stage the company's at. So we are happy with a team that is below par, because you can boost it, you can put people around them, but you can't change the fundamental technology. And so I think, Paul made a good point. You do meet people, you go, God, I wish I had a better idea. They look like a great stellar team, but they've got terrible technology. And then either way, you can put them together with something else. But of the two, perhaps controversially, I think sometimes if you think the technology is wonderful, then you can make efforts to add to the team and you can really support it. And I think that's a bit of a part of what early stage VCs do, because it's not uncommon to come across a team that not necessarily done it before, haven't got the skills. A large part of my job and other VCs that we work with is hiring people and putting them into the companies and building that support network around them. And that's why some of the accelerators that we know about are great. They can do that. The difficulty is if it's when people feel that it's their company, that can be quite tricky, and they don't want to accept change. That's a bit awkward. Because the quid pro quo of raising VC funding is you don't own the company anymore. You've sold some of it, and they have a view. And those other people's view might not be the same as the founder. And so it's important to work together. And my last observation would be, we invest for a long time, Paul invested for a long time, Liz has invested for a long time. You've all got to get on. So if you don't think you're going to be able to get on to start with, it's better to walk away at that point.
Okay, so it all seems to be coming back to the personal interaction that we keep coming back to several times. So the personal interaction shouldn't be undervalued alongside everything else. I'd agree with what you said. You said there, what the panel said actually, that the technology is what the company will rise or fall on. back when I was actually making investments, one of the first discussions I would always have with them was exactly what you outlined there, Oliver, is, you know, we might have a team that can run the company for the, you know, the next couple of years in the development stage it currently finds itself in, but not everybody has the right skill and ability to take a company from the bench all the way to the market. And there has to, you know, the founders would then probably have to realize that there may come a time where their skill set no longer fits, or they haven't grown with the role that they're in, and they have to maybe either change or in the worst case leave. And it's always best to have that discussion at the beginning rather than find yourself 4 or 5 years down the line and then having to have the discussion. And they thought that, you know, they were going to be working with this company until the end of their career, or leading the company even till the end of their career. So it's probably a good thing to have right at the beginning, that there's an understanding. You may make it, you may not.
Well, there's a fairly well-known US fund that uses the expression that CEO stands for current executive officer.
Good. I hadn't heard that one before, but that's a good way of putting it. So we've had we've had a couple of questions in the chat room. I think one of them is a little bit too detailed to get into here, you know, about what VCs, which people would know before they moved in. But one of them, and maybe if we can ask the panel here, is about advice on what to do and what not to do when looking at market size estimates when you come to a VC. I think we touched on it ever so slightly before, and that was I think Paul touched on it about not necessarily coming in and saying this is, you know, the size, you know, I'm gonna be able to capture this much of the market, but rather convincing people that there's an unmet medical need that your company, or sorry, an unmet need. It could even be, like we said before, prawn farming, and an unmet need that your company and technology or products would be able to solve. But if you are, I mean, you do still need to obviously show what the market you're going to be moving in. Is there any advice that any of you think you could give on what the do's and don'ts are in looking at market size? Who should I go to on that? Does anybody want to put their hand up rather than me picking on people all the time?
Well, because I mentioned it, why don't I start? And I think it's the broader point here is that actually what one investor likes another won't like. So it's a tough game, and you need to sort of pick up on body language and stuff as you go. My personal preference is not to start high level and say, you know, the pharmaceutical market, or start by saying, you know, pharmaceuticals are companies are failing to discover drugs and it costs so many billion to develop a drug. It's stuff that, you know, folks already know. I like being led into an opportunity by saying, here's the problem that we solve. And actually that problem is, you know, roughly per unit or per person or per something, that costs someone that much money. And there's a lot of people in the world like that. And you know, a reasonable estimate would be you times that cost by something and you get to a big market. Now, I'm going to tell you exactly what problem we solve and where in the market we might fit, but you can see it's a big opportunity. And as an initial pitch, that engages me more than there's a problem in the world that we can't invent new pharmaceuticals or something, because, you know, that's not really news. So it's just the way that I like to be sold an opportunity, but it's a preference. So it's on that kind of market opportunity, it's gauging the right level for the audience, something that will resonate and something that won't trigger questions that, you know, it's really easy to question market assumptions. So I would try and avoid as many of those as possible and just understand what the problem solving economics are.
Understood. So a little bit of do your homework approach as well. So Liz, I can see your hand going up and down. So
yeah. So I spent the first part of my career working out what market opportunities there were for listed companies' drugs. And when I work now with companies either with my VC hat on or when I'm advising companies, the big thing I say is have your evidence to hand. So just like Paul said, you need to know that the market opportunity is there, but you need to be able to support your argument of why you feel that this is how you're going to deliver on that market opportunity. And for me, that's less about the actual size. Is the market 100 million, a billion, 2 billion? It's more about showing me that you as a team have done your homework and have delivered the evidence, and you understand the market opportunity and how you're going to commercialize it. So even saying that there's another drug on the market that does X, but ours is better, and that drug is 100 million and our drug is better, and we're going to be able to take some of that market share, but also grow the market. That's as valuable as just coming in and saying to me, this is $1 billion market. And in fact, I prefer the first argument because you've thought about how you're going to get to the opportunity out there.
Oliver, anything to add on that?
Well, I think that really is correct. I think the key thing here is the addressable market, to be realistic. So, it's great. Big figures are wonderful, but they're not true. So be realistic on what you think your drug or your product is going to compete against. So you have to be aware of the competition. Be realistic across the world. Whilst the population might be X billion, are you really going to sell it into all those countries? Think about what your costs might be. So think about how that restricts who the payers are, where it's going to be sold to. So it's all about, of this mythical 100,000 people that you're going to sell to, if there's only 20,000 people who are ever going to be able to afford it, and you're only going to get 30% market share, the market's a very different size. So even just a simple back of the envelope calculation, working down from the big figure to a real addressable figure, is much more compelling. And then to Liz's point, right, show some references. I see lots of market data reports where people find really huge figures because it sorts their argument. But when you look at them, classic is the diagnostics format. It includes diagnostics and reagents and everything that's ever sold. And the real market is nothing like that. So be realistic and be aware of the competition, because they are also going to try hard to sell products into a market, and you've got to be able to beat them.
Yeah, that actually, the comments you've just made at the end there have actually led me to two other questions. I'm trying to think of which is the best to go with first. You touched on the end competition. How do you guys react to people that come in with a pitch and just say, look, I'm so wonderful, I have no competition?
I can tell you, my favorite is the table where they have the features and benefits, and there's always ticks on the company that's talking to you. And they always stop and they never go to the next bit. So, it's laughable. But sometimes it's true, but you've got to be realistic about what you're bringing to the table versus the competition that's out there. And that's much more compelling. Be honest if you can't do
Liz, Paul, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm working with one seed stage business where the CEO went and looked at every single clinical trial of every single company in its competitive space, worked out what has succeeded and why it had succeeded, and where the other companies were in relation to this particular business. That is an incredible piece of valuable work, not only for the CEO and the management team, because they know what went wrong and how to make sure that they don't make the same mistakes in their clinical trial. It's an incredibly valuable piece of work for the investor, because they have a very clear understanding through the CEO of the competitive space, and they understand what the CEO and the team need to do to show that they're better. So the competitor chart wasn't just a series of ticks, but it was a very well thought out comparison of why this particular product is going to succeed where maybe others didn't, or is going to get a bigger market share. And that's an amazing piece of work that just increased that companies, in my estimation.
Paul, anything you want to add?
No, I broadly agree. I mean, that whole competitor analysis, if you are a genuine step change company, that you should just use that to highlight what the step change is or what the real competitive advantage is. So it's it's not acceptable to say there is no competition. That's an opportunity to show you, for you to show how you differentiate, even if there isn't a real competitor. But yeah, broadly in agreement.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. I think if I put it all together, is you never say you have no competition, but you can use it as not only as an example of how, a time to show exactly why you are better than everybody else, but to show the level of knowledge that you've built up around the area that you are in there. So even if you don't truly think that they compete with you, I mean, at some level, they're moving in the same circle. So you can use that as an example of how to show how much of your homework you've done, and to keep coming back to homework. One of the other ideas or one of the other questions that what Oliver was talking about earlier on about being realistic brought me to another point, which I'm going to raise here now, and maybe split it into two questions. It's about remaining realistic, and also when is the right time to start discussing, and how realistic should you need to be around the old bugbear of valuations. So who's going to put their hands up and take hold of that tiger by the tail? Nobody. Off you go then, Paul.
Where I start, I mean, because I've been kind of on both sides of the table, and when it comes to valuation, I think it's really important for folks to genuinely understand what the implications of varying valuation is. So there's no substitute for sitting in a dark room on your own with a cap table that you've made on your own, and it's not too difficult. You can teach yourself to do this with a Google search quite quickly, and then just play around with the numbers and work out what is comfortable for you as a founder and what's uncomfortable, and then ask yourself, why are you comfortable with that? Is it just because it's a number on a sheet, or is it there needs to be some rational conversation with yourself? And then when there are changes to proposals on valuation, go back to that spreadsheet and then see how you feel. But do that yourself with your own tables, play around with the numbers, see how it makes you feel before you react to anything that anyone says, and always be open to discussions around that, because what might be a real emotional deal breaker for someone is perfectly acceptable to somebody else, and what you're in a conversation in is how can we come to a deal that works for everyone. And there are many different ways of getting benefits out of an investment, and many different mechanisms. So, but that fundamental play around with the cap table yourself, I think, is the way to go about it.
Good, thanks for that. Liz, sorry.
I was just going to add, I think Paul's point is very good. You need to look at where you're going with the cap table. The other couple of points I just want to add is, don't forget you've got multiple rounds of investment. No company that I have ever worked with has ever managed to get a product to market on a single round of investment. Might be because I'm in healthcare, it might be because I've done a lot of biotech, but it takes a lot of money and a lot of rounds. So if you're in pre-seed and you're giving away 90% of the business, 5 years down the line and $50 million later, you're going to have 0.5%. So really think about your investment journey. Don't like that word, but that's what it is. How much are you going to need to raise over 5 to 10 years to get your product to market? And what does that mean today? What is the value of the money that you're giving away today? The other thing is that it always really annoys me when people come with completely unrealistic valuations, because they haven't looked at the competition, the investment space, the value of the ultimate product, what market share they can get. I'm not going to give you $1 billion if actually the end market is worth 100 million. So be realistic.
Oliver?
So first of all, Liz, being snarky, it's selling a bit of your company, not giving away, because you get the
selling. Okay, fair enough, Oliver.
I was thinking there's loads of tools you can play with this, and it's always really hot and quick. And so there are funds out there that are very generous on valuations and funds that are really not generous on valuations. Classically, the EIS funds are a bit more generous on valuations because they don't care as much, because they get a refund from the tax breaks. And that's wonderful for founders, and I'm all for that. Can potentially create problems in the next round because those companies then have to move on from EIS funds to somewhat more hard-nosed big healthcare funds, and there might be pressure on the valuation at that point. But my observation is twofold. So think about your de-risking points, because you can think about what you need to raise to get to a key point, and you don't necessarily have to go out with what you thought you're going to raise to start with. So it's not uncommon for us to come across a company that's definitely worth 5 million and they want to raise 2.5 million, and that'll last them for 3 years. But in reality, the investment evolves over time and they raise a bit less and they're worth a bit less, but they get to a de-risking point and they've got to do a bigger raise. All those conversations are possible, and it reflects the engagement in the venture world, the experience of the management team, and the plans that evolve. So I would think about your plans and what you need to get to. I would definitely bear in mind Lizzie's point about the ultimate value of the company. You know, how much it's ever going to be worth, because that does put a cap on what you can expect to raise. And then think carefully about how much you're going to raise over the time to get to your exit point, because it's never going to be one round. It's going to be at least 2 or 3 rounds. And each round has to show up increased value. Otherwise, what's the point of getting a new investor on board? They're not going to be interested. So those are all things that you need to consider. But then there's still an option pool. So companies that have got a founding team that are active, they top up their equity via the option pool. And there's a fundamental truth, which is in the biotech world, because it's expensive and risky, a founder will almost inevitably end up with less in a company over a 10-year period than, say, a founder of a software company will. Because that's just how these things have to work, because they raise from VCs and it's a different funding structure. If you can get to revenue, that's great, but that's quite hard for a drug development company. So there is, the balance there is that obviously the exits for biotech are bigger. So while you may own 2% or 5%, a sale of £1 billion is a far bigger return than a £200 million company that you own 10% of. Put the two together, I think, and then work it through in your head and work out what's happy. And ultimately, my last observation is, if you're struggling to raise, that might tell you something about your valuation expectations.
Good. Okay, good. I'll leave it there on valuation, because we could probably spend the whole day talking about that one small aspect of a fundraising. And just turning to one of the other questions that we've had in here, something we haven't touched on, that elusive animal, the lead investor. We've had a question through the chat here about, does it turn other investors off if you mention at the beginning that you have already, in the first meeting, that you already have a lead investor and you're looking for others? Now, of course, that might come down to the point of how real that lead investor actually is. That's probably the first question. But, you know, is that something that you think is useful to say that you have one, or is it something that you would leave for a second date?
Can I take this?
Sure.
We lead on lots of rounds, and we also join rounds where we're not the lead. I think the question I always ask myself is, why are they telling me they've got a lead investor? Are they asking me to join the syndicate, or are they trying to get into a bidding war? They want somebody else to go out and compete in term sheet. And I think the challenge for some founders is to be realistic. The VC world is actually quite small. We all know each other. So I know Liz reasonably well. I meet Paul once or twice at conferences. And a really interesting deal, a good VC will show it to other good VCs, and they will syndicate, because you need to raise money. So it feels great to get into a bidding war with VCs, but it doesn't often work that successfully in some areas. It can in others. So that'd just be one observation. But it does help them move quickly. So I think it's a really useful thing to mention if you want to close a deal quickly, because it's a terrible thing to feel that you've been left behind because you're a bit slow moving, you're being a bit lazy in your analysis when the company's got another term sheet on the table. It definitely makes a VC make a decision quicker, which is great.
Yeah, I was going to say that actually, Mark, your point, I agree with Oliver, but Mark, your point about, is it real? So I've been in plenty of situations where I've been told that somebody has a lead investor, and all that is somebody's had a good conversation, and the VC said, yeah, I really like it. It's really interesting. If we move ahead, our range of investment is 1 million or 5 million. You go, wow, I've got my lead. This is brilliant. Until there is a term sheet on the table with their name on and clear terms set out of what that investment looks like, you don't have a lead investor. You just don't. It's a complete fallacy. And
caveated with tons of further diligence afterwards as well. So they've not even done a diligence.
Yeah. And I was going to get onto that. So even after you've had the term sheet, they still have 2 weeks, a month, 6 weeks, 2 months worth of due diligence, which they then do, and then they present it to their investment committee. And still at that point, they can say, go away, this isn't happening, for a number of reasons. And it could be as simple as, actually, the fund doesn't have the money to invest, or they've found a different group has come in with a different proposition. So this lead investor, unless there's a term sheet that you are negotiating on the table, whilst it's very nice to be told you have interest, and it can make me excited, and I don't think there's a problem with it, I won't believe it until you come to me with, this is a deal that somebody else is investing at, do you want to join? And then, as Oliver said, we all know each other. I've worked in various relationships with most of the investors at some point over the last 15 years. Nobody wants to have the reputation of screwing anybody else over. So we will show it to other people, because we want somebody else in there for the next round, which is going to be bigger. You're on mute.
3 times in an hour is not too bad. Paul, anything to add?
Not really. The scenario of dates to the prom comes to mind, and honesty is the best policy. Oliver, I'm not saying that you're like a bunch of high school girls talking in the toilets to other VCs, but yeah, I mean, if somebody asks if you've got offers, then someone's interested in taking me to the prom on Friday night, but they haven't really asked yet. I'm open to offers, but honesty and when asked, not as a boast.
Yeah, but make it, if it's true you've got another term sheet, then that's great, but don't use it like an estate agent trick to try and push out a better offer.
Yeah. And actually, Oliver's point around trying to negotiate a better deal, it's like, I'm not interested, and I'd probably walk away if you started trying to be silly about it. I don't want to work with a founder who's going to mess me around and then mess other investors around, because you're going to need more money, and if you've got a reputation, you're not going to get it.
Understood. So,
and this just sorry, I was going to say, this does link to the valuation as well. I mean, if you're trying to leverage valuation, you need to understand what the point is, and there's probably little point in messing around trying to get people to increase the valuation. When you look at the end of the journey and what difference that makes on the exit, it probably makes very little difference at all. Therefore, why risk the whole game?
Yeah,
understood.
I think you're right. I think it can. I mean, we've had term sheets where we put the valuation up a little bit because you have a conversation and it makes sense. But it is difficult if you've agreed a valuation of 2 million and then somebody says, actually, now I've got another offer, I want 4 million. Then it's like, well, sadly, we're not the right fund fit, and we need to go and take the other term sheet. And that, well on the founder for doing that. Congratulations, and I can understand the motivation completely. But we would not be able to suddenly go from X valuation to Y, because the chances are we've gone to our IC committee, we've got support for valuation internally at that point. It's a big change to something that the company's not done anything, but it's become twice as expensive. It's a much harder proposition to win internal support for.
Yeah, and that's probably one. Sorry, Liz?
Yeah, I was going to say, and actually, Oliver's point, you often haven't done anything. The only time I'd be willing to review evaluation is if something material has happened. So you've got really good set of phase 2 data that actually, when we started talking, you didn't have, or you've suddenly out-licensed to J&J for worldwide rights, but you still need a bit of money to do something else, but it's the same platform. It's got to be a big change for me to consider a change of valuation. But often what happens is, through my due diligence, actually I might come back to you with a lower valuation because for whatever reason, the risk is greater, the market opportunity presented is smaller, your clinical trial is underpowered. You know, there might be a reason why I come back, but then you're free to say no, that you're not happy with my revised valuation.
Understood. Anyway, we're coming towards the end of our time, so I think there are two overarching messages that I've heard out of here. One is do your homework, and two is it's about building a relationship. And if I stick on that relationship theme, just to throw one last question to the three of you and see how you react. One of the things I've always heard is that even when you're going into this first date with a VC, they're already thinking of the divorce. How they're going to exit an investment, and you know, where they see the potential for what at the end of the day is what the VC is there for, which is to make money on the investments that they're putting into these companies. Is that something that you recognize, or is that something that you would say, no, that comes a little bit later? Nobody's going to put their hands up, so I'm going to pick on Oliver. Sorry, Oliver?
Yeah, I think it's a definite thing you think about. I think it's different in some industries to others. So in the biotech space, pure play drug development, the kind of the business models and the exit options are clear. You might mentally think who might be the acquirer, but the classic is that a company comes to raise money, goes through to some point towards the end of a phase 2, and then ideally goes through an exit. It's a bit harder, if I'm honest, in other companies, or digital health companies at the intersection between health and tech. You might have to think a bit hard about who an acquirer might be, or whether it goes to a flotation, goes public or something. But it's definitely there, because ultimately all VCs need to get out of the companies invested in to put the money either back to an LP to make them a return, or back into the fund, keep investing. But it's so, and it's for the founder's point of view. Otherwise, unless the founder wants to work there forever, they probably want an exit as well at some point.
Okay. Any?
I was going to say, depends on the type of fund. So if you're a closed-end fund and you've got to give your money back in 10 years, then actually what you're looking for is to spend the first 2 years investing and start exiting at years 5, 6, and pretty much have all of them in the process of being exited by year 7. So actually you need to think about that. You also need to think if it's an EIS or VCT fund. With an EIS fund, they don't want you to exit in 3 years, because that messes up the tax implications. So actually, you need to think about whether or not, if you find something in the next 3 years and you're invested by an EIS fund, will the investor block your exit? And what does that mean? Now, hopefully they won't, because if it's a good enough deal, it won't matter, because around the tax implications, because there'll be so much upside. But it might not be. And also, you know, we're all in this for the money. The founders, the VCs, we're all in this for the money. So actually the VC has to make their return. They have to make a return in a reasonable period, not 20 years down the line, but in a reasonable period. And that depends on the investor.
Paul, anything to add?
I don't think I'm really honest, but honesty, again, everyone should be clear what they're in it for. And some founders will say, I want to see this get to a patient. Some founders will say, I want to put my kids through private school. There's nothing wrong with both of those things. But not saying that at the beginning and being consistent is really important. Everybody needs to understand what they're getting out of it.
Okay, good. Well, we're up against the end. I don't know if we've got any ability to overrun, but before I close, make some comments at the end, just to ask people if they want to say anything that they feel that they haven't had the opportunity to say. Obviously, going to have to keep it short. We've only got just over a minute. Oliver first.
Well, just for young companies, it's really hard work being a founder. It takes a lot of effort. And so, you know, congratulations on going down that particular journey. I've never been a founder of a young company like that. It's very hard to do, but, you know, remain focused on what you're trying to deliver, I think, is the key outcome. And roll with the knocks, because it can take a long time to raise money. So I hope it goes through.
Good. Paul?
No, nothing more to add other than agreeing with Oliver. It's tricky out there. Go with your gut feel, work hard, and fingers crossed.
Liz?
Yeah, the only other thing I was going to add is it should be fun. It shouldn't be just hard work. You should enjoy what you do. You're going to spend 12
While
hours a
you're doing
day,
it, yeah.
365 days a year for 5, 6, 7 years. So make sure it's something you're passionate about and you're fun. And if you're passionate, if you're having fun, it will come over. And at least half the problem, which is around the relationship building, will have gone away, because we want to invest in people like that.
Okay, good. Well, hopefully that's been useful to the people that have been in the audience. Thank you very much, Oliver, Paul, and Liz, for your inputs, and hopefully, that will help people to be a little bit more prepared for their first meeting with a VC. And then with that, I'll turn it back to Jane.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Oliver, Paul, and Liz. That was really insightful. Lots of useful info. I was just going to remind everyone actually that all these recordings are going to be available on the platform for a couple of weeks. So if you want to come back and revisit some of this, a lot of info in there. So that's open to you as delegates. So we're going to break for lunch now, 45 minutes. Please do go and have your meetings. Go and look at the expert area if you haven't done so yet. Otherwise, have a bit of a break. We're back at 2 o'clock for our session on building a fantastic team, which, as we've heard from both panels so far this morning, is absolutely key. So I'm really looking forward to that. So yeah, thanks once again, Mark and the panel, and we'll see you all back at 2 o'clock. Thank you.